All right, well, I'll open us with prayer this morning. Well, Father God, we thank you that we get to come together and worship you through learning, worship you through studying your word and seeing what it has to tell us. We thank you for the gift of your word. We thank you that you have given us a way to know you and that you have not left yourself mysterious to us. We thank you, Lord, that you speak plainly, that you speak clearly, and we pray that you would give us ears to hear, eyes to see wonderful things in your words, and heart to believe. Father, we pray these things in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus. Amen. Well, guys, this week we are going to be looking again at the topic of Christian generosity as a spiritual discipline, but we're going to be approaching it from the perspective of common questions that people have. So just to recap where we were last week, we said that when we talk about spiritual disciplines, we want to focus on generosity, cultivating generosity, rather than simply just giving. We said when we discussed just giving as a spiritual discipline, we give off the impression that our actions are more important than our attitude or our heart orientation towards God in what we're doing. And we said it's better to focus on the heart because actions can be done with a wrong motive. Actions can be done in ways that simply communicate, I'm doing this because I have to. And focusing on actions can also breed a form of legalism in our behavior. We can start to focus on questions like, in the case of generosity, how much do I have to give? How often do I have to give? One of the questions that you actually hear quite often, and I'm surprised that this is a question that comes up because it to me, it would just reveal the legalistic attitude is, do I have to give out of my gross income or my net income? You know, these sorts of questions come up when you focus on the action. But if you focus on getting the attitude of your heart in line with what the Bible says it ought to be, then we can come at the idea of giving or any actions we might take in generosity and trust that if our heart is right with God, then our actions will fall in line as well. Last week we talked about what Christian generosity looks like, and we said that it is joyful, it is proportional. We're to give according to the means God gives us. It is beneficial to us, and it is something that not only benefits us, but benefits the world around us. We said it's supposed to be purposeful. It's supposed to be for the advancement of God's kingdom, to bring him glory, and to care for the people around us. And we talked a little bit last week about some of the issues that people sometimes have with generosity. Specifically, we mentioned the idea of receiving generosity seems to be almost foreign to our culture, but we'll touch on that more as we get into it today. What we want to do today is we want to take what we've seen last week about Christian generosity, and we want to ask, what are some of the common questions or common concerns people have with what we believe about the spiritual discipline? And so we're going to start with the question we didn't get to last week, which is, well, what about tithing as a practice? And then we'll deal with a couple more, and hopefully we'll have time at the end, and I can turn it over to y'all if you have any questions as well. Does anybody have any questions from last week that we want to clear up before we get going with the questions we're going to look at today? All right. Then let's go ahead and let's dive into our first common question people have about Christian generosity, and that is the question of, what about tithing? Now, almost all of us, if we've been around the church for any length of time, have probably heard someone talk about tithing. And many of us have heard specifically at some point along our Christian journeys that Christians are supposed to give at least 10% of their wealth to God in some form of a donation or another. This is often said to be based on the Old Testament practice of the tithe. And you'll sometimes hear people say, well, a tithe is 10%, and so you give 10%. And in fact, there are many Christians, there are many pastors, there are many authors who say that Christians are unfaithful if they don't give at least 10% of their wealth to God on a regular basis. They might disagree on how often that needs to be. Most that I hear just say regularly, but here and there you'll get some very legalistic folks coming in and saying every paycheck you better have that first 10% set apart for God, otherwise you're being unfaithful. Now, the question we want to ask today is tithing something that is a necessity, something that Christians ought to be practicing according to the Bible? Is it something that we need to do, or we're being unfaithful in our Christian generosity? Now, not to, as it were, bury the lead on this, I will go ahead and tell you the conclusion that we're going to come to. The answer is no, it is not necessary for Christians to practice tithing, in the sense that if you don't practice tithing, giving 10% is how we're going to call that, then you're being unfaithful to God in your generosity. But how we get there is going to be kind of a long journey. So we're going to start by looking at the Old Testament to see what was tithing during the Old Testament times, because more often than not, the practice of tithing as it occurred in the Old Testament is misunderstood due to our perception of tithing today. We think of tithing today as just give 10% of your wealth and you're being faithful to God. But let's dive into the Old Testament a bit, and let's look at the practice of the tithe as it pertained to the people of God in that age. Three passages in particular are the ones that we're going to look at that mention the tithe, or tithes, plural, to kind of give you a preview. There is Leviticus 27, 30 through 33, Numbers 18, 20 through 28, and Deuteronomy 14, 22 through 29. And I'm going to ask for volunteers to read each of those. I'll have them up on my screen. And if you want to just read from whatever translation you have, go right ahead. And who would like to read for us Leviticus 27, 30 through 33?
I'll take Deuteronomy.
Okay. So who would like to read Leviticus?
I can read.
Okay.
Every tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. If a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, he shall add a fifth to it. And every tithe of herds and flocks, every 10th animal of all that pass under the herdsman's staff, shall be holy to the Lord. One shall not differentiate between good or bad, neither shall he make a substitute for it. And if he does substitute for it, then both it and the substitute shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed.
All right. Now, I'm going to say we're not going to get too much into the idea of redeeming things out of the tithe today. That is something that we could talk about. I'm going to focus more on the tithe itself. But let's move to Numbers, and let's read Numbers 18, 20 through 28. Who would like to do that for us?
I can do that.
Okay.
And the Lord said to Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in their land, neither shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people of Israel. To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance in return for their service that they do, their service in the tent of meeting, so that the people of Israel do not come near the tent of meeting lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall do the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And among the people of Israel they shall have no inheritance. For the tithe of the people of Israel, which they present as a contribution to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance. Therefore I have said of them that they shall have no inheritance among the people of Israel. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Moreover, you shall speak and say to the Levites, when you take from the people of Israel the tithe that I've given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present a contribution from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe. And your contribution shall be counted to you as though it were the grain of the threshing floor, and as the fullness of the winepress. So you shall also present a contribution to the Lord from all your tithes, which you receive from the people of Israel. And from it you shall give the Lord's contribution to Aaron the priest.
All right. And then, Mom, I believe you said you wanted Deuteronomy.
I'm just going to read from my own Bible, okay?
You go right ahead.
Each year you are to set aside a tenth of all the produce grown in your field. You are to eat a tenth of your grain, new wine and oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock in the presence of Yahweh your God, at the place where he chooses to have his name dwell, so that you will always learn to fear the Lord your God. But if the distance is too great for you to carry it, since the place where Yahweh your God chooses to put his name is too far away from you, and since the Lord your God has blessed you, then exchange it for money and take the money in your hand and go to the place the Lord your God chooses. You may spend the money on anything you want, cattle, sheep, wine, beer, anything you desire. You are to feast there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice with your family. Do not neglect the Levite within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you. At the end of every 3 years, bring a tenth of all your produce for that year and store it within your gates. Then the Levite who has no portion or inheritance among you, the foreigner, the fatherless, the widow within your gates may come, eat, and be satisfied. And the Lord your God will bless you in all the work of your hands that you do.
Mom, is that the HCSB?
Yes.
I find it interesting that they translate strong drink as beer. That's fun. All right, so these are the 3 main passages in the law, the books of the law, that mention the tithe, the practice that we're going to be looking at today. The first passage just mentioned tithing in general, and it kind of explained a bit how it was done. We saw that the tithe of the land was supposed to be from the fruit of the land. It was the seed, the fruit of the trees, or the herds and the flocks. It was from the benefits that the people derived from being in the land in Israel. They would basically set aside a tenth, or in the case of the herds and the flocks, every 10th animal that would pass by as they were separating out. The next passages mention the specific ways the tithes were to be given. The first passage or the first tithe in Numbers mentioned is the tithe for the Levites, the priests and the Levites, since in the dividing up of the land of Israel, the Levites who served the tabernacle, who served God, they had no inheritance given in the land. Their inheritance was the tithes from the people of Israel. That was how they were provided for. This is the tithe presented to the Levites. You also had in there the tithe of that tithe that went specifically to Aaron the priest. That was his tithe, as it were. The second tithe is what I'm going to call the feast tithe. This is given to the people of Israel so that when the feast came, that they were supposed to rejoice before God, when they would celebrate what he had done, learn to fear him, to worship him. The Israelites were told to set aside some of their produce, again, from the fruit of the land, be it livestock or produce, crops, as it were. They were to set that aside to be used for this feast. Now, what's really interesting about this is they even tell you if you can't go to the location of the feast, it's just too far away to carry all of this stuff, then sell the stuff that you were going to bring as a tithe for the feast and just get some money and then buy what you would need for the feast when you get there. again, thinking about this a little bit differently than we normally would, the person who is enjoying this tithe ultimately is the person giving it, because it's providing for the celebration that they are to do. I do also find it interesting, we won't go too deep into this, but I do find it interesting that one of the things listed for the celebration is wine or strong drink. This is not normally what we think of when we think of tithing. We don't think of going and buying some wine or going and buying some beer to enjoy. This is a bit different, as you can see already, than our normal conception of the tithe. The last tithe we will call the provision tithe, as it were, and that's the one that provides for, again, the Levites during this year, but also for the widows, the orphans, the sojourner or the foreigner who doesn't have any inheritance in the land. This tithe is given every 3 years to provide for these people. I don't want to say a welfare system because I don't want to get into political ramifications, but essentially a welfare system to provide for those who cannot provide for themselves. This is set up in the law of Israel. Now, these are the 3 tithes that were commanded of the people of God. If you go back to the Old Testament era and you talked about the practice of tithing, this is what people were doing. Now, you can already see this is very different from what we talk about when we talk about tithing today. When we talk about tithing today, we just say, whatever money you have, give 10% of it. That's how you donate to God. That wasn't the case in the Old Testament. For example, the Mosaic Law in none of these passages requires a monetary tithe. It only ever asks for a tithe from the fruit of the land or the produce of the land, be it livestock or crops. Now, people have sometimes objected to this fact. They've said, well, Israel was an agricultural society, so that was asking Israel to give of their wealth. Yet, as we saw from dealing with the text that speaks of the feast tithe, Israel clearly had an economy. They clearly had monetary wealth. They were supposed to be able to sell their tithes to someone and get money that could then be used to buy something when they got to another place within the land. And so we see they had money as we would normally consider it. They had some form of monetary wealth in addition to the wealth given to them from the fruit of the land. And they were never commanded to give of this. They were only ever commanded to give the inheritance that God had given them in the land itself. Again, this is already different from what we normally consider to be tithing, because we would look at tithing and say, well, that's clearly all of your wealth put together, give 10% of that, be it monetary or whatever. In the Old Testament, it wasn't the case. It was very specifically geared towards giving 10% of what God had given them in inheriting the land, the promised land, the land of Israel. Now, the tithes under the Mosaic Law were also not strictly 10% either. Again, we hear today the practice of tithing, give 10% of your money, that's tithing. Well, the fact is there were multiple tithes each year and another every 3 years. And that means that if you're giving 10% each time, then you're giving more than 10% off the top. Some people have actually tried to calculate that over the course of the average 3-year cycle, the Israelites would donate 23 or so percent. I'm not going to be bullish on that specific number, but somewhere around the 20 to 30% of the land's produce would have been counted as a tithe, depending upon the year that you were giving, whether it was every 3rd year or whether it was a normal year. And so again, we're seeing this idea of, well, the tithe is just 10%, being not quite the same as it was back then. More than that, the tithes, the totals, they weren't exact. Take, for example, if you were to tithe animals, let's say you had livestock, and you were supposed to tithe every 10th animal that passed under the shepherd's staff from that livestock. If a person owned 20 cows, they would tithe 2 cows to the celebrations or to the Levites, whatever it may be. But if they owned 15 cows, well, then they were required to tithe 1 cow, because you can't give a tenth of 15 cows to someone. It's not, the cow is going to be not alive at that point. And so you didn't have an exacting requirement here. It was more of a general idea. And again, this is somewhat different than we think of when we think of tithing today. Most people who would speak of tithing today wouldn't necessarily speak of it as a loose thing. It's 10%. It's not 23%. It's not 1.5. It's 10%. Now, the difference between tithing then and tithing now is very significant to us, because if we are making the case that Christians today need to tithe because it was something commanded by God way back when in the Old Testament, then we might want to say we need to be tithing like they were tithing, because this is the only place God has commanded people to tithe. But no one does this today. No one gives of their produce of the land because A, we're not in the land. No one provides for Levites because we don't know who they are anymore. That whole idea is something that would be very hard to trace in this day and age. We also don't have sojourners in the land of Israel that we are providing for. And so things like that do not come into how we tithe today. And so looking at these commands in the Old Testament, just on the differences from between what they were to what we consider to be a tithe today, we would say we're not talking about the same thing. And if we're not talking about the same thing, and this back in the Old Testament is what God has commanded, then we would say today we're not commanded to do these things. Now, why? Again, because we are not in the same situation. Again, we have no inheritance in the land to tithe from. We have no Levites that we must support, nor do we have mandatory feast days that we must attend. The New Testament does call us to provide for those who preach and minister the word. It calls us to provide for widows and orphans, but there's no prescribed system by which we must do so, such as the Old Testament tithe. This is never commanded of the Christian. Instead, as we talked about last week, that provision is meant to come from the generosity of the Christian heart. It's meant to simply come as we are led to give by the generosity we have cultivated in our hearts. Also, I'll mention this, we don't want to go too far into this today, but it's highly debated among Christians whether the Mosaic Law has any ongoing authority over the believer today. A lot of Christians would say, no, it doesn't. And if one holds the position that the Mosaic Law, the commands given in those books, are no longer binding at all, then obviously the tithe commands would be non-obligatory. But I think we can simply say that the tithe is not obligatory on the Christian simply because it's not something we could fulfill today. We don't have the resources or the purposes for which to do it. This was a very culture-bound command. Now, I'm going to pause right here and let anybody ask any questions they want to ask, and then we'll keep going with some objections that people will lodge against what I just said. Does anybody have any questions? All right, so let's keep going. Let's look at some objections that people will have to saying the tithe is not obligatory for Christians today, that you don't have to tithe, as it were. And by that, we mean how people have kind of just, I want to say haphazardly understood tithing as giving 10%. Some will object that the practice of tithing, of giving 10% of whatever wealth you have, actually isn't found in the Mosaic Law, but it's something that arises previously in the Old Testament. For example, two big examples will often be mentioned of this. Abram, when he gives 10% of his war spoils to Melchizedek, and Jacob, when he pledges to give 10% to God. Let's look at those passages real quick. Would someone read for us, and they'll be on the screen as well again, Genesis 14, 18 through 20, and would someone else read Genesis 28, 18 through 22?
I'll read the first one.
Okay.
And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything.
All right. So here we have Melchizedek, a priest of God. And I will say you can go down a most interesting rabbit trail trying to figure out who Melchizedek was, what his significance is, and things like that. But we'll just leave it as he was a priest of God back before you had things like the Levitical priesthood. But it says Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Well, that's interesting. We'll come back to that in just a second. I'll go ahead and I'll read for us Genesis 28. This is Jacob. It says, So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give a tenth to you. Now again here, prior to the Mosaic Law, we have Jacob vowing to give a tenth to God. And he doesn't list on the wealth of the land or on crops, he just says a tenth. And again here, we have Abram giving a tenth of everything to Melchizedek. And people will point to this and they'll say, well, that's what we mean by the tithe. We mean that practice where you give a tenth of everything to God, and it should be done. And they will usually argue these are an abiding principle. This tithe idea is an abiding principle because it pre-existed the law, and therefore it would endure beyond it. And they'll say, in addition, Jesus commanded the tithe. Now that's interesting. If Jesus commanded the tithe, that's something that we should look at. I'll read this passage as well. This is Jesus speaking to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. He says, Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. And so people will look at this and say, well, Jesus is saying they're tithing even of the smallest herbs that they have. And he says, you ought to have done these things. You ought not to have neglected these things. In other words, he is saying the tithe is still in effect, and it's something that should be done. So how do we reply to this? If what I said earlier is true, and that we aren't required to tithe today, if we aren't required to give 10%, how do we respond to Abram before the law giving 10%, Jacob before the law vowing to give 10%, and Jesus in the time of Jesus, so well after the Mosaic law was given, still saying the tithe ought to be performed? Well, we'll respond in several different ways. With regard to Abram's tithe to Melchizedek, he wasn't Abraham at this point, we want to note several things. Abram was not commanded to tithe. Nowhere does God tell him you must do blank. God does not tell him to give 10% to Melchizedek. His only obligation was a vow that he made to God earlier in this section of Genesis to not keep any of the spoils that he took from the battle he was about to have. We also want to note that his tithe was not of his wealth. It was not of the monetary wealth that he possessed. It was from the spoils of the battle that he had just had. He pledged to God, I won't keep anything that I take from my enemies. And then once the battle is over, he gives 10% of it to God's priest, and the rest of it he is going to keep. And so again, he's not giving of stuff that he possessed as his wealth. He's giving of things that were given to him in battle, as it were, by God. Also, we want to note, there's no evidence anywhere that Abraham continued this practice. There's no other record of him seeking out Melchizedek and giving him 10%, or even giving 10% of anything to God. Likely what this is it's reflective of a cultural practice that was known in the ancient Near East at the time, not any divine command. And if you look back at historical record of this place and this time period, the idea of giving 10% of something as a tribute to someone else was well known. And in fact, we might even say that the Mosaic law was fashioned to reflect a cultural practice that the Israelites would already be familiar with. They would be familiar with the idea of giving 10% as a tribute. And so when God commands, give to provide for the Levites, give to provide for the feasts, give to provide for foreigners and widows and orphans, he simply goes with what they would know and already be familiar with, the idea of 10% of specifically the fruit of the land in this case. But in Abram's case, there's no example that this is a practice that he did continually throughout his life. We only have this singular instance of him doing this. Well, but what about Jacob, people might say? Jacob tithe? Well, again, not necessarily. Once again, we want to note this is an isolated occurrence, not an example of an ongoing practice in his life. Again, Jacob has never said to tithe anywhere else in his story. And again, it's not commanded. He offers this as a vow to God, and we'll ask whether this is really even a vow as we might understand it. It's unclear from the text, and in fact, if you hear preachers or commentators talk about this text, they'll mention this. It's unclear whether we're meant to perceive his vow to tithe, quote unquote, as a good thing. In fact, if you read it, just on the face of it, it seems to be an action born out of unbelief. Because what does he say? He doesn't say, I love God and I worship him and therefore I will give him 10%. He says, if God keeps me safe, if God provides for me, if God does all these wonderful things for me, then I will give him a tenth of my stuff. Then he will be my God. In essence, this is Jacob living out his character that we've seen him with throughout his story, which is a bargainer, a guy who tries to make deals that benefit him. In a very real way, this could be that as well here. And again, there's no evidence that he tithed during the time in between making this vow and 20 years later when he finally gets to come home with all this stuff that God has given him. If you know Jacob's story, he gets suckered into working for a family member for 20 years in order to marry someone, and ends up getting 2 wives out of the deal, but we won't go too far into that story. But in that entire thing, there's no evidence that this was a practice that he continually did. Instead, this seems to just be a vow made to get something in his mind from God. Now, God intended to bless him regardless because it was part of God's promise and his covenant with his people. But Jacob seems to be acting out of a bit more selfish motives, you might say. But let's say, well, Abram and Jacob might have only been doing one-time things, but didn't Jesus still commend and in commending it, command a tithe? Well, no. When we look at Jesus speaking to the Pharisees and he says, you ought to have tithed, we need to remember the context of Jesus's time and Jesus's speech. During this time, all of God's people, the Israelites, would still be under the Mosaic law as the law that they decided to govern themselves by in this place, in this time. Granted, the Romans were in there. They were bringing their own laws and things like that. But the law of Moses was still in effect when Jesus was speaking these words. And so when he's saying, you ought to have tithed, we need to remember, again, these are not the tithes that we think of today. These are not just giving 10%. In fact, he mentions mint and dill and cumin. This would have been the produce of the land. And it would have been given for the purposes that we had mentioned, providing for sojourners, providing for feasts, things like that. Likewise, we need to say Jesus nowhere commands, and no one commands in the New Testament, giving a 10% offering from our wealth. Now, all of this to say, is tithing, as we understand it today, giving 10% of your wealth, a bad thing? No, obviously not. If we're meant to be generous, and we are generous by giving 10% of our wealth to the church or to other causes, charitable things, that's not a bad thing. What I do want to say is it's not commanded. Nowhere does the Bible set down on believers living today a percentage that we must fulfill. Instead, it calls us to generosity. And of course, I will say the classic thing you may have heard many people say about giving in the New Testament. Giving in the New Testament could even be seen to be greater than the idea of a tithe, be it 10% or 23%, whatever it is. Giving in the New Testament is meant to be fueled by a generous heart, and a generous heart doesn't ask, how much must I give in order to match what God has set as the standard? The generous heart says, what opportunities are before me, and how can I provide for them? Can I do this? And so in practicing generosity, a lot of people have said, well, maybe the tithe isn't required, but it could be helpful. It could be helpful to say, hey, I'm going to get into the practice of generosity by committing for myself to give 10% of whatever I have in order to be generous. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I would say, if that helps you, that is great. What we get into is problematic times where people require tithing and say this is something you must be done or you are unfaithful to God. I can think of a very obvious and sort of famous example that came up when a well-known TV preacher, he was caught on one of his sermons saying that he wished he could shoot non-tithers because they were being disobedient to God. And he said that if he had his way, he would set up these scanners at the front of his church where when people walked in, it would scan their credit cards and their bank accounts to see whether they'd given 10% to God. And if they hadn't, a big alarm would go off saying, you know, crook, crook, crook. And then he would pull them out and shoot them with a machine gun or something. Now, he later said that the machine gun was like of God's spirit. So I don't know what he means by that. But that sort of mindset of if you don't give 10%, if you don't tithe, then you're unfaithful to God and you are bringing dishonor to your Christian profession. That's not in the Bible. And that's one thing that we want to talk about when we talk about generosity. Generosity is not a matter of percentages or specific actions that you must take. It is a heart attitude. that seeks out opportunities to help and to provide for God's kingdom and God's purposes. Now, I'll pause here with tithing. Does anybody have any questions about tithing before we move on to our other common questions?
Well, I have a comment. You said several times that the tithing was 10% of your wealth, but surely it was 10% of produce, of new income, and not, well, no, perhaps not in the terms of the flock. If you passed the flock under the under the rod, I don't know if that was all your flock or just the ones that were born that year. But certainly in the terms of grain, it wasn't necessarily 10% of what you had in your stores, but 10% of what you had taken in that year, surely.
Yes, yeah. And when I say of your wealth, I'm speaking more of how people today think of the tithe as being specifically of money that you are bringing in. And so, yeah, even then it's new produce.
Yes, that's what is usually understood as being 10% of your income and not 10% of your gross net or your net worth, you know.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that people debate back and forth on, you know, how should you consider that? I think most people, when they speak of tithing, are talking of the money coming in to you through work or whatever means you have, be it investments or something like that. So yeah, and again, the difference between the monetary concern we have today and the concern of the tithing in the Old Testament is significant, because the Old Testament Israelites were never commanded to give any of their money, and they obviously had it. And that's one of the fascinating things to me when I look at that, is their tithe was not what we would consider necessarily a tithe today.
It's also striking when you talk about Jacob, that one wonders how was he to give it to God. And Abraham gave the tenths to the priest, and in the law you have to give it to the temple, to the Levites, to the poor in your area. But how was Jacob going to give a tenth of his flock to God?
Yeah.
There was no religious organization to whom he could give it. He could have sacrificed all as a burnt offering. That seemed a terrible waste, because he was pretty wealthy by the time he came back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of imagine Jacob might not have understood how much he was going to have when he made the vow.
I like your comment that he was bargaining with God. If you bless me, I'll give you the tithe. I like that.
Well, and it is kind of his character that you see throughout his story. But we won't go too far into Jacob as a character, although he is a fascinating character in the Genesis story. All right, well, let's keep moving into common questions. Well, does anybody else have any questions about tithing before we get going? All right, let's keep moving into common questions. So the next common question that we want to look at, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing accordance here for a minute. And I didn't turn my camera back on, I muted myself. All right, there we go. Now I'm back. We'll go back to accordance when we look at verses, but the next question we want to ask is, should you give to causes outside your local church? Now, this is actually a question people ask. They say, well, generosity, we're meant to give, we're meant to provide. Are we providing for things outside of the church, outside of the church I go to? Now, we might be tempted to just say, well, of course you could, because a lot of us were taught to do so, but it's helpful. Oh, no, wait, sorry. I skipped something in my notes. The first question we want to ask is, should you give to your local church? That's the first part of this question. So people asking, should I give outside of my church? Well, first we want to answer, should you even give to your church at all? Now, this is where most of us are taught to simply say, well, yeah, of course. Any of us who have been in the church for very long have heard at least one sermon about how we are to give to the local church at some point. And that's an easy answer, but we want to see why. Why do we actually give to our local church? And then we'll ask, should we give to stuff outside the local church? Well, so we give to the local church for several reasons. It's actually very beneficial to do so with our Christian generosity that we're trying to show. Giving to the local church is important because A, it helps provide for the people who dedicate their lives to ministry toward God's people. That's our pastors. It also provides the local church as an organization wealth and resources to use in aiding its community. For example, in the case of Redemption, we do this through feeding the homeless, through buying food for Church Under the Bridge, for providing for people with benevolence. When somebody comes into the church and says, hey, I have this need, is there any way you can help me out? We often give to them money or gift cards or something like that to pay for gas, groceries, light bills, these sorts of things, hospital bills. And we do that out of the money that's been given to the church. It provides the resources to do that. It also provides for the church, it allows the church to provide for those who take the gospel to other communities, that is, our missionaries. This is actually one of the things we do as a church is we set aside part of our budget, which is only the money that is coming in through giving. We set aside part of that to provide for the missionaries that we have a relationship with. We give a certain portion of our budget to them every year so that they can continue to do the things we can't do, to reach the communities we can't reach, and to help them. It also provides resources for us to take the gospel into our own community via outreach efforts, block parties, gospel tracts, which we don't do a lot of, but a lot of churches do, VBS, things like that, as we go out into the community to share and spread the gospel. Occasionally we'll do it with VBS, or occasionally we'll do it with a block party, and we have to provide things for that in order to do it. And this allows us the ability to do that. It also provides the church with the ability to secure a location to meet the needs of the congregation. This be Redemption's building, Redemption's property, things like that. We now have a place that can house all of us when we meet together. We could do it New Testament style and try to meet in people's churches or in people's houses, but I doubt any of us have a house that's big enough to fit, 100 people on a good Sunday morning. And if we do, it's going to be very uncomfortable, and especially right now, very unsafe. The idea of giving to your local church is you're providing for the church, meaning the congregation of people led by the elders, to do these things. You are providing for them to provide in other ways for the community and for the people in the church. So if the question is, should you give to the local church? The answer is, yeah, you probably should. Now, the question that people have is, okay, well, I'm supposed to give to the local church. Should I give to causes or people outside of the local church? Is it appropriate for me to be giving in my generosity to anybody other than the church? Or should I just direct all my funds to the church, since that's God's entity that he wants to provide for and through? Well, the answer I would say is still, yeah, you could give to people outside the church and not have any issue. You're not in any way being unfaithful in doing this. In ages past, you might find Christian writings or preachers from other ages who encouraged believers to direct all of their generosity to the local church. This was because, though, in those times, the local church may have been the only entity that could effectively minister to the needs of the world. For example, you go back into the Middle Ages, there was no charitable organization that you could give to. There was no parachurch ministry, things like that. You gave to the church and trusted that the church would distribute and care for the widows, the orphans, and for the spread of the gospel. These are things that were done, and so a believer would simply direct all their giving to the church and trust them to meet the needs of the community. However, even in those sorts of time periods, even in those sorts of cases, you still would have personal acts of generosity. You would still have people giving to others or to a family or something like that when they were in need, and it wasn't considered inappropriate. And so even during times where you might have found Christians saying, yeah, direct all your giving to the church, no one found it inappropriate when someone would give, kind of above and beyond to a different person or a different cause. And in our day and age, we have even more reason to do so. In our day and age, there are many different organizations and entities that are out there that are dedicated to meeting various needs and are quite honestly better at it than your local church, be it Redemption or any other local church. In many, many, many cases today, the local church actually defers to these specialized organizations when it comes to meeting the need of the community. For example, at Redemption, we will give to, say, Church Under the Bridge to meet the needs of Houston's homeless, or we provide resources via the baby bottles and the blankets and things like that for the Pregnancy Help Center. We give to them as a church because we believe they are more able to directly meet that need than us trying to be that kind of catch-all entity that takes care of everyone's needs. And it's kind of sad to say, but the modern local church in our culture is very ill-equipped to be kind of a one-stop shop when it comes to being generous and charitable and meeting all the needs of a community. We have not necessarily set up our churches in this day and age to do that. Now, that may be a bad thing, but it is simply the reality of our context that we live in, is that these other organizations, these other groups, things like that, are just better suited to it than many local churches. And so if the question is, should I give to organizations? Should I be generous with my wealth to individuals outside of the local church? The answer would be, yeah, definitely. You should still probably be generous with your wealth to your local church, because your local church does do a lot of stuff. But in our day and age, the local church doesn't do everything. And so there's plenty of opportunities for generosity outside of the church itself. And it's not inappropriate. It's not being unfaithful to your church or anything like that. In fact, most of our churches, I know Redemption does, encourage you to give outside of the church, because we want generosity in all aspects of life and we want everybody's needs to be met, even if we can't be the ones to do it. Now, does anybody have any questions about this before we look at our last common question? All right, the last common question I have for generosity is, what if I don't have enough money to be generous? What if I just don't have the money to give to someone if they are in need, or give to the church or one of these other organizations that we just talked about? And this is actually a really important question. Now, some people will treat this question a bit hostilely. Some people will look at this question and say, well, that's someone that's trying to get out of, giving money or things like that. But I want to treat it very, very appropriately, because it's a real question that honestly a lot of us will find ourselves asking at some point in our lives. What if I don't have enough money to be generous? Now, typically the answer you get to this is, well, you likely have more than you realize, and so you can still be generous. Unfortunately, that answer might be more unhelpful than we want it to be, or than we intend it to be. First, I do want to say that answer is often true. If someone says, well, I don't have the money to be generous, and you say, well, you probably have more than you realize, that's often the case. It is often true. We live, especially in our culture, in an age of abundance. And many of the things we consider to be necessities to our lives are often just luxuries. I give an example for myself that often comes up when I deal with this question, which is, for myself, I often throughout the week will used to stop by the gas station and pick up an energy drink and a granola bar on the way into work. don't do that as often anymore because I don't leave the house as often anymore in this time period. But, stop by, do that. Well, those aren't necessities. You could easily just drink water at work and not have a granola bar or something. And I could direct those funds elsewhere. This is what people mean when they say you probably have more than you realize, is there's probably an ability to be generous that you don't quite comprehend because you're looking at your life and you're seeing what you're spending money on and not necessarily realizing that that could be somewhere else. But you also want to say people can be generous outside of monetary means. Their generosity is an attitude, not necessarily a specific action in the sense of giving money. You can be generous with people or groups or your church with your time. You can be generous with your labor. You can be generous with your homes, if need be, opening up your home to someone else. Very often, I will say, the church would rather its people be generous with their time than their money, because we often have a dearth of people being able to do things rather than people giving. It's actually a problem a lot of churches will have. But let's say someone genuinely is approaching this question and they look at themselves, they look at their lives and they say, I don't have the money to be generous. Well, then this answer, well, you probably have more than you realize, becomes kind of flippant. It becomes unhelpful. A person who responds this way could be unintentionally communicating to the person asking the question, I don't care what your situation is, you still need to give. And worse still, there are similar answers that are given sometimes by what I'll say are the unscrupulous false teachers in our world. Think of the guy I mentioned earlier who wants to shoot non-tithers. If that person says, well, you probably have more than you realize, they are intentionally communicating, I don't care what your situation is, you still have to give. And that's not what we want to be communicating, because there will be situations that come into people's lives where there is no ability to be generous. There is no ability to give specifically wealth to others, to give money to others. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that these times will come, and they'll probably come for some of us at some point in our lives. In fact, I'd wager many of the people in our churches right now are experiencing that just because of how many job losses we've seen due to the situation we're living in. So what do we say to someone who legitimately tells us, I don't have money with which to be generous? Well, we can remind them that generosity, as it's portrayed in the Bible, always has two sides. The one being generous and the one receiving generosity. And sometimes people need to be on the receiving end of Christian generosity. And this is a lesson that many of us will often overlook. You often have people teaching about the need to be generous, but very rarely do our churches teach about the need to sometimes allow people to be generous with you. As the author of Ecclesiastes taught us, in everything there is a season. Sometimes the Christian is called to a season of need rather than provision. And so if somebody comes to you and says, I legitimately don't have any money with which to be generous to give to people, I'm massively in debt, or I don't have a job, I'm impoverished, I can barely feed my family. Well, that person should not be told, well, you still should give. That person should be told, let me give to you. Let me help you. Let me aid you. This was actually Paul's point in 2 Corinthians 8:13-15. Now, we looked at this text last week, but I want us to look at it again. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll pull this up. So 2 Corinthians 8:13-15. Oh, and of course, I don't want to look up second or. I'm terrible at typing. All right, 2 Corinthians 8:13-15. Paul says this. He says, I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened. He's talking about taking collections and giving. He says, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. This is Paul's point in his passage here, that there is a time where people within our ranks, Christians, will need to be recipients of generosity, and those of us who have will need to provide for them. And at some point, they will probably be providing for us. Our desire should be to have the ability to be generous, but there may be times where we don't. And there's no shame in lacking that ability for a time. And moreover, accepting generosity during these times is an important step towards gaining the ability to be generous again. If someone is legitimately in a situation where they say, I don't have anything with which to be generous, then we should provide for that person to help them and to get them as a byproduct back into a place where they can be generous with others. That was kind of Paul's idea here. Provide in your abundance for those who lack, so that in their time of abundance, they can provide for you when you lack. And we do ourselves a disservice if, when someone legitimately asks a question like this, we only ever teach on the need to be generous without also teaching that there's times that you need to receive generosity. As Paul says, both are the will of God. Both are a part of this thing we call Christian generosity. Now, that's all the questions I had. We're kind of over our time, but if you guys wanted to stick around and if you had any questions, I'm glad to stick around and answer them. So I will turn it over to y'all. If nobody has any questions or comments, we'll just call it a day, and we'll close the session out.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you. All right, going once, going twice, and sold. All right, so this week we've finished out Christian generosity. Next weekend, and I will send you guys an update via email. The elders are meeting possibly right now. They're meeting today at some point to discuss what our plans are going forward, because we are seeing kind of a second wave spiking of the coronavirus. And Harris County, which I believe we're in as the church, has issued their stay-at-home suggestions. We can't call them orders anymore, but our elders are meeting to discuss what the plan is going forward, whether we pause again, whether we pull back and say we'll go back to videoing, that sort of thing. So I'll send you updates on what we're going to do with this class based upon what they decide to do in their situations, or in the situation of the church. So we may move back to Sundays if that's a possibility, or we may be sticking on Saturday if they want to, maybe have like one person go into the church and film on a Sunday morning, now that we've got all the live streaming set up or stuff like that. But I don't know what their decision is going to be, so I'll let you know. But hopefully I will see you guys again next week. Next week we are going to be talking about what I call the forgotten spiritual discipline, and that is fasting. And we'll talk about what the purpose is for it, why the Bible encourages it, and what to do and not to do in fasting. So I will see you guys next week.